The teenagers had been up all night. And when you hear that sentence, you know it's not going to end well. But in this case, it's actually exactly what the parents had wanted. They had hired a DJ to play rock and roll music late into the night so that 2,500 gathered high schoolers could sit and fill balloons without getting tired in the wee hours of the morning. This was 1986 in Cleveland, Ohio. I am sure that the DJ was a really cool DJ with some good rock and roll music playing during this evening. The grown-ups had been doing their part too. For weeks previous, they had been planning and holding meetings with city government, paying payments for police overtime, even alerting the Federal Aviation Administration of their plans. And in a whole city block of downtown Cleveland, they had set up for this night as well, at the foot of Terminal Tower. Terminal Tower was built in 1927. At the time, it was the tallest building in the world outside of New York City. That was a long time back when Cleveland was a city on the rise, when it was the 5th largest city in America and a major hub of industry. But that was a very long time ago, and by that night in 1986, Cleveland wasn't rising anymore. By that point, it wasn't the 5th largest, it was the 18th largest city in the United States, and dropping fast. Businesses had moved out of town, and the ones who had stayed in Cleveland had spent a lot of their time poisoning and polluting the Cuyahoga River, which would catch on fire over and over and over again. It was so polluted. The last time it happened was in 1969, and when it happened, it made the national news and made Cleveland a national joke. It was called the mistake on the lake by people. And the epitome, it was the epitome of industrial decline. Its population would eventually fall by half. And one civic leader had an idea. He wanted to spread some joy around town. After all, it had already been 20 years since the river had caught on fire last. And he had just been made the chairperson of the United Way of Ohio. So to lift spirits and to show that Cleveland was turning a new leaf, this gentleman borrowed an idea he had seen from Disneyland. The year previous, Disneyland had celebrated their 30th anniversary, and they did it by filling 1.2 million helium balloons and releasing them up into the sky over Anaheim. And it was beautiful, and it was fun. And not only that, but it made the Guinness Book of World Records. They would do better. Cleveland, actually not one better, Cleveland would do 800,000 better. If Disney did 1.2 million, Cleveland would release 2 million balloons, send a cloud of joy up into the air. And with the balloons would rise the spirits of a people who'd been through it for the past couple of decades. So plans started. A 3-story tall scaffolding was built. A net that would expand as the balloons were lifted up into it was held over the scaffolding, and hundreds of feet of copper tubing were laid out with spigots so that people could stand in lines and fill latex helium balloons, of which 2 million of those balloons, biodegradable latex, which were more expensive, were ordered, and 2,500 volunteers were rounded up to fill those balloons through the night. Most of those 2,500 were members of marching bands. Volunteers were all marching band members from local high schools. The organizers figured 2 things about the band students. First, they figured that they were used to playing instruments, and so their fingers would be nimble and able to do a difficult task like that. They also figured that they were band kids and they wouldn't have anything better to do on a Friday night. Sorry, band kids. I love y'all. That was from the interview itself. I didn't say that. So they started out, and by morning, they were behind. They only had about 1.4 million balloons filled. But really, when they thought about it, who cared? It was still 200,000 past Disney's record, And really, if you were looking up into the sky and you saw a cloud of 1.4 million balloons, would you be able to tell the difference between that and 2 million? Heck no. And so at 1:50 p.m., with a gigantic crowd gathered, just under 1.5 million balloons rose over what is today America's 54th largest city. And it must have felt like things were looking up as this giant wave, this billowing cloud of color extended up into the sky, forming this mass, swelling and flowing with every breeze that would catch it. Can you imagine what that sight must have been like? It would have been spectacular. Now, dear congregation, familiar with the laws of physics, as you no doubt are, you will know that when something goes up, it must come down. And similarly familiar with Cleveland's reputation in the national ethos, you probably know this isn't going to end well, and it's not. Because as those 1.4 million balloons came down, chaos ensued. Most noticeably were the hundreds of thousands that landed and deflated in Lake Erie, where they choked and killed untold numbers of birds and fish. There were also the drivers on the freeway who were going along, minding their own business, and then suddenly swerving and colliding as a slow-motion blizzard of balloons blew across the freeway for over an hour. The airport in Cleveland had to shut down for that afternoon while workers picked a thick layer of latex balloons, many of which had melted and stuck to the freeway off of the the runway, picked them off. And most tragically, the two fishermen whose boat had capsized in a storm on Lake Erie, and when the Coast Guard went out to look for them to rescue them, the Coast Guard was looking for their brightly colored life jackets on the surface of the lake, but all they could see was a gigantic confetti-colored mass of balloons, and they didn't recover these fishermen's bodies until 2 days later. The Guinness Book certified it as the largest balloon release, with 1,429,624 balloons. And just in case you at St. John's want to beat it, we're in our 75th year, and you're thinking we could do 2 million balloons. Let me just suggest that maybe this is one of those records where we should let it stand and maybe on into forever. I love a celebration. But how does something like that go so wrong so fast? And I think about that not just with this celebration, but the other celebration, the one that we really remember today here in church at Palm Sunday, because let me tell you, I love a parade. I think I would have loved that parade, that ramshackle group of people that threw a parade as Jesus was entering Jerusalem that day, that hoopla that came up around Jesus. It must have been amazing. People praising Jesus as he comes into Jerusalem, saying to each other, things are looking up. We're a people on the rise. But in a celebration that magnitude, where Jesus is lifted up and crowds shout his name, I always wonder, how does it go from that level of adulation to just a few days later, that same crowd that was shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in celebration, they'll be crying, crucify, 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 calling for his death. That event in Cleveland, those high schoolers, they stayed up all night filling balloons. And as they walked home from the event, they were cursing those balloons. One high schooler said that he was walking down Clifton Boulevard, which is a major thoroughfare in Cleveland, and he said it was like a nonstop asteroid field of popped balloons everywhere you stepped. The same thing happens on Palm Sunday. The tide turns suddenly with the crowd to where a few days later they will absolutely turn on Jesus. How does this happen in such a short amount of time? Hosanna means save us. They're shouting, save us. And then they turn. And what I want you to see is that the origins of Holy Week, of the things we'll remember in the days ahead, the roots of Jesus' wrong and violent death, they start right here in many ways with the happy, excited Palm Sunday crowd, as doubts will eventually drive a faithless crowd to turn on Jesus. Now, this is sort of more or less the end of most of Jesus' ministry. Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, which is the mother city of all the Judean people, but it is also a city under occupation by the Romans. And there's tension because of that. And there are a lot of folks in Jerusalem this day because it's the eve of Passover, which is one of the big holy days in the Jewish calendar. But what's more, if you think about the nature of Passover, this was going to be a tense couple of days. Passover, you may remember this because you've watched the Ten Commandments movie, and Moses is Charlton Heston. But what happens in Passover is it's the day where the people remember that they were slaves in Egypt. And Pharaoh ruled over them and dominated them, and God freed them. He heard their cry and gave them liberty, gave them a place to be their own nation. So you can imagine there's a tension. They're celebrating how God liberated them once, and now they're dominated again. So Jesus and the disciples, they come into this city that is teeming with people who are agitated. But there's also a Roman garrison that's probably entering the city that same day just to keep things buckled down, keep the boots firmly on people's necks, and make sure they know their place, make sure they keep their heads down. There's tension all over the place. That's why you have people showing up waving palm branches on Palm Sunday. They want Jesus to be this reiteration of Moses. Save us, just like Moses did. So they shout, Hosanna. They wanted to be that city on the rise, not unlike a group of amped up high schoolers times 100. Just this feverish hope that Jesus can save them. So how do you go from here to there? Well, I think it's actually kind of easy to figure that out if you look at Palm Sunday from a different way. Usually we want to focus on Jesus' viewpoint on Palm Sunday, and that's definitely worth doing. But if you look at it from the point of view of the crowd, it makes perfect sense that they would turn on him. It's sort of predictable. Because what happens is they sort of quit on him midway through the week. Have you ever been to like a baseball game or a football game, and the home team, they do so bad, they play so poorly that the hometown crowd will turn on them and start to boo? If you haven't, I'm a New Mexico State alum. I'm very familiar with this sort of dynamic happening all the time. That is what's going to happen in Jerusalem during this week, where people there will turn on Jesus and quit on God. And don't put them down for that, because you know what, we're capable of that too, believe me. So why would people do that? Well, I think there are a lot of things going on psychologically, and you can sort of sum them up in fairly simple sentences that make a good point. The first thing I see happening is that's not the way I would do it. That's not the way I'd do it. That's the first seed of doubt. They weren't happy with how God was doing it. I can relate, because there are times where I think, oh man, if I were God, I'd be so good at that. Like, I'd answer all the prayers. I would make sure there were no people suffering. That is not the way God does it. That's not the way I do it. And this is the essence of Palm Sunday. Jesus comes riding into town on a donkey. I guarantee you when that happened and they saw him coming in, what he was riding on, every Judean who was standing outside those gates, they said to themselves, well, shoot, that's not the way I would do it. He should come riding in on a stallion, rearing at the gates. They were anticipating Jesus arriving as a victor and a conqueror, and Jesus has the audacity to come in on a donkey. That's how you begin to change the crowd from cheering him on to yelling crucified, because that's just not the way I'd do it. I'd grow a little skeptical. I'd be saying, God, I just wouldn't handle it that way. You can see how this works out and how it can break a relationship of trust, not just in the world of Bible stories or theology. You can see this in everyday relationships. I bet if you really looked at friendships that have ended or people you've known where relationships ended or things like that, maybe in some, like a lot of the time, I think you would see at the core of it, that's not the way I would do it. You want to look at how anger can flare up, set two perfectly normal people in a house and say, one of you load the dishwasher and the other one will judge how they did it. Do you do it this way or do you do it that way? There's only one right way, and everybody knows the right way, even if it's always different. You want to talk about real controversy? Let's be serious for a minute. Does the toilet paper go over the top of the roll, or does it go underneath? Marriages have died over this issue, where people say that isn't the way I would do it. I wouldn't do it that way. See, this is the human dynamic, and I know these examples are trite, but they're to make a point that people bring into their relationship with God these kinds of mindsets. And they look down the path, and there's Jesus pulling into Jerusalem on a donkey on the wrong ride. Bad visual, parade ruined. And doubt will creep in right there with, that's not the way I would do it. Starts right there. But there are other things going on that day too. Another thing I think people are thinking is, we've tried, and you hear this in church every once in a while too. We tried this before and it didn't work. The Judeans are waiting for their Messiah to roll in, and they start feeling a little bit suspicious about Jesus. I think a big part of why is they tried this before, actually with dozens of Messiahs. We know historically there were other people who claimed to be a Messiah, and they would come and get into some kind of confrontation, and it always ended the same way, with the Romans squishing that person. Failure. So the crowds think they know how this goes, and it's better to be on the winning side. And then there's this. As the week progresses and the rest of the crowd starts expressing their doubts, when that crowd starts to doubt, the natural tidal pull of peer pressure will pull along even the best of us. And you want to believe. And you're trying to believe, but when others look hard and you can look around and see other people turning away, it is easy to just go with that. And it doesn't take long for the masses to start expressing doubt. More and more of them as the week goes by, to the point where by Friday, even Jesus' close inner circle, they are running for the exits, trying to find anywhere to hide, trying to stay out of sight. There's nothing novel about this. It's actually quite predictable, where every day that follows, it builds. As Jesus enters Jerusalem, he confronts the religious people with their hypocrisy. He turns the tables over in the temple and wrecks this system that they had built and the greed that went into it. And leaders in the temple start crafting lies about Jesus. And Jesus isn't helping because he's teaching things that are hard for people to accept, which we should do, but it's hard. And as time goes by, the crowd sees all this happening, and one by one by one by one, they start to doubt. And soon you have critical mass. That doubt takes on a life of its own, so that the people who were shouting, Hosanna, will fall by the wayside. You take that all together, it's pretty easy to quit on Jesus. It's pretty easy to quit on God's work and plan as it will unfold. It's pretty easy to doubt. But here's the deal. You don't act, if this feels real in your own life, you don't have to feel guilty about that. Because there's an antidote to that level of doubt. And the antidote is just to be real about your doubts. It's okay to doubt. God isn't going to zap you or squish you if we reveal that our faith is not complete. There's no such thing. That's a myth. Be honest with your doubt. Bring it to God. I mean, if your doubt is real, what even is the draw of pretending everything is all right in our faith when it's not? All you end up with is like this fake veneer, this fake faith. And that's actually the one thing that Jesus doesn't tolerate. In the Gospels, when people come to Jesus with a fake, showy faith, he comes at them hard. But Jesus never has a problem with people who come to him with a faltering faith. I mean, wouldn't you much rather have a church full of people with a faltering faith than one where it's all fake and there's no freedom to have questions or doubts and no way to express that? There's this great story in Mark. I wish, we'll preach on this sooner or later. I wish I had time for it today. It's in chapter 9 of Mark if you want to read it. There's this encounter where this father brings to Jesus one of his children, and he is terrified because the child is very, very sick. It's looking grim, and the child is probably dying, and he needs Jesus to heal his child. And Jesus gets with this father and says, okay, let me ask you, do you believe? And the guy says, Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. And Jesus doesn't say, sorry, pal, no, sir, go back and get your faith right and then come to me. He heals the child. Jesus isn't mad at faltering faith, not when it's honest and transparent. What's hard about this is, where do we have an environment to talk about our doubts? You can't really do it out in the world. The world is a treasure trove of fake faiths. That's what social media is. You go out there and you see people whose lives are perfect when we know that nobody has a perfect life. That's fake. That's the big lie. This is what the Cleveland United Way wanted to do, is we're a city on the rise. Just look at all the balloons. Don't look at the industrial decline or the joblessness or the poverty. Just look at the balloons. It's toxic to paper over all of our doubts, even if it's hard to be real about them. Church can be really insidious if we're not careful to cultivate space for doubt. And it's the one place we should be able to be real. You want to know what doubt looks like here? Go to the hospital with us. I visited the hospital for someone this week. Molly does it quite regularly. There are some among you who are on visitation teams for hospitals, but also for our homebound, or some of you are chaplains, or you work in nursing. And I go sometimes as a pastor, having spent my week getting ready for the sermon and drenched in the Word of God and loving God and wanting to follow a calling, and you go and you pray, and many others may be praying too with you for people who are suffering and hurting and going through it in the hospital, and there seems to be no progress sometimes after those prayers. And you know what happens in the walk back to my car? I doubt. Because I wouldn't do it that way. And I tried the prayers, and the prayers didn't work. And I have to have people in my life. We all need this. People who I can turn to and say, I need to lean on you because my doubts are really real today. I'm struggling with them. That's why we need church. And that's why church can feel really lonely when it's not that. But when we can come here and be transparent and honest about that, that's the source of our strength. It's so counterintuitive, but it's true. I have one last thing, and I have to get to it. I know I'm a little over today. I knew this sermon was long today, but before we're done, in that kind of environment where doubt can be so heavy, I think what Holy Week will teach us is our best hope. And I really believe this, that our best hope, whatever faith that you have, act on it. Act on it. When you're struggling, and I know struggles are real, and you're praying and you're not even sure who you're praying to, act on that faith. if you feel a calling to serve and you feel compassion for a community, but you're not sure what to do, or it's bigger than you, or you're not able to make a difference, if that's what the form your doubt is taking, act on whatever faith you have. Not sure about the whole forgiveness thing. You feel you know from church that we're a people of forgiveness, but the hurt is real and it's big and it's strong. Forgive where you can. Act on that faith. Whatever mustard seed, little tiny speck of faith you have, hold on to it by the skin of your teeth if you have to, and act on that and see what happens. Because I love how the Gospels describe this. After the crowds go home, after Jesus is arrested, after Jesus is mocked and ridiculed, and his disciples run for it. After Jesus dies and he's in a tomb, even though all of this happens, the women are going to go out on Sunday morning to Jesus' tomb, even though they have doubts. They're going to act on that little bit of faith that they still have, what little they have. There are these few people who continued on. And what they encounter, we're going to talk about next week, but it will blow up. And it's for people in the world who have decided that even when doubt is there and it's real, they are not going to quit on God. And neither are we. So let's pray. Gracious God, we know our doubts, and pretending that they're not real is not working out. We also know that faith and doubt are almost the same sides, are almost different sides of the same coin, and we can live with that and the discomfort of that. So we come into this house of faith today with our faith, but we also give you our doubts. And we trust you to be there in the midst of it, and we trust you to be waiting for us in an empty tomb in a few days' time. It's a long journey to get there, and it doesn't all feel good. But there's joy when we get there. So we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.